Yeah, well, thank you. Welcome everyone to our DP0 Delegate Assembly. Today we're going to have a special presentation by Jen Kotler within an accessibility hackathon. So Jen is going to tell us about the notebook accessibility and authoring guidelines. And after that, we hope to start putting those guidelines into practice with notebooks of our own. So as usual, we have the agenda. We're gonna do a few announcements about the upcoming DP0 assemblies. As I mentioned, we're gonna have the presentation by Jen on notebook accessibility and authoring practices. Jen Kotler is a UX designer and user experience designer at the Mikulski Archive for Space Telescopes, MAST, and part of the Space Telescope Science Institute. Then after the rooms, depending on the number of people that we have, and hopefully we can all work together in implementing these guidelines. Jen is going to give us more detailed instructions about how those breakout sessions should go. And we hope also that people discuss and then see what works, what didn't work, and then they report back within their group, and then they come back to the main room, and then we can all together discuss how our experience with this was. Okay, so the future DP0 seminars, we're gonna have a Stack Club on November 17, that's next Friday. And then after that, the next Delegate Assembly on December the 8th, we still need to find a topic. So I encourage, if you have done anything cool with DP0, just let us know, and we'll be more than happy to have you here as our guest. This is just for redundancy. These are the instructions about the breakout rooms. So Jen is gonna bring them back, but what's gonna happen is we're gonna have some quick introductions, and then you're gonna have a notebook, and then hopefully people were gonna discuss about how to implement the guidelines that Jen is going to talk about. As I mentioned, we hope for people then to discuss within the breakout room, and then at the end, please pick someone to report back to the main room. I'm just leaving the slide here. This is just a heads up, but Jen is gonna remind us of these instructions afterwards. Okay, I think that was what I had to for the introduction, and now I need to stop sharing, which I never find the button, but I just did. Okay, Jen, please take it away.
Sure. Okay, hello everyone. Let me share my screen and then put it in presentation mode. Fabulous. Okay, so hello, I'm Jen Kotler. I work at MAST, which was mentioned already. It's Mikulski Archive for Space Telescopes at Space Telescope Science Institute. So I work on the archive that hosts data from James Webb, Hubble, TESS, Kepler, a lot of telescope missions, and I am a user experience designer. So I don't come from a science background or even a coding background. My focus is on design and how the decisions we make in creating tools influences how easy or difficult they are to use. And so today we're going to be focusing on Jupyter notebooks and their accessibility. And there's a lot, this is a deep dive. I mean, there's a lot to talk about that. Welcome. Okay, so before we dive into Jupyter Notebook specifically, I wanted to talk about accessibility in general. So if any of you have had any experience or interest in accessibility as a topic, you're probably familiar with what the word means, but just to go over it again, it has to do with designing experiences in a way that they work for the broadest set of capabilities of people. So if people have different needs, but when we're designing accessibly, we're trying to encompass the widest swath of people, and we might have options that work for different needs. And this includes people with disabilities, but doesn't only reference people with disabilities. Other specialized needs might have to do with language recognition. If like someone is using a tool in their second language, it might have to do with their knowledge base. So, and this is particularly useful to think about in the sciences, because we're working with some very in-depth challenging data that people spend many years getting PhDs for, right? But not everyone has those PhDs yet. We have students who are interested in first exploring this data and all the science, but we can't assume that they have the same background as someone with a PhD. So right, when we're designing accessibly, we're thinking about all these different, the spectrum of people and all their different needs, what they might be. In particular, when talking about disabilities, some of you may have heard of the curb cut effect. In case you haven't heard of it, I'll go over it. It's this idea that when designing, when coming up with a new design that allows someone with a disability to access a space or a tool, it might help everyone as well. And so the common example is a curb cut. That's when there's a ramp that goes up to curbs on the street. This was initially designed for people in wheelchairs to allow them to enter and exit streets and sidewalks. But the truth is, it's actually useful for everyone. When studies have been done, people who are walking normally will all go out of their way to walk up a curb cut because it's slightly less energy, and people prefer that. People with strollers, people carrying lots of packages. So this design, although initially intended to enable someone with a disability, actually helps everyone. And so that's an important thing to think about when we talk about why we might want to be exploring a more universal design and actually focusing with people with disabilities, besides the fact that we want to be more inclusive and we want more people to be doing science. And so if you're interested in this topic, I recommend looking at universal design as a concept. There's a lot of guidelines of universal design that are great places to start. So the sad news is that STEM careers, which is what we're all in, have significant accessibility barriers right now. And I started hearing about this when I was working on a sonification tool, and I was trying to speak with the disabled community with their experience getting degrees in the sciences. And it just seems like a common story, unfortunately, that students, depending on the disability and depending on the science, it's not uncommon to hear people dropping out of their science major because pivotal tools don't work with assistive technologies that they might be using. And there's no inherent reason that people should not be able to work in science because of a disability, if the tool is built accessibly. So, and then the interesting, like, kind of keystone of this is that notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, are actually one of these major barriers, because when you think about how common Jupyter notebooks are in the sciences, they're incredibly common. They're common in education, and they do not work with screen readers and other assistive tech that people use. And people do drop out of school, change their major, just stop pursuing their data science career because of that. So this brings me to this project I worked on a lot of last year. It's on pause right now. Well, I should say it's not actively being funded right now. We plan to work on it more in the future, but it's called Notebooks for All, and astronomy notebooks for all specifically. So this project was a collaboration. We got funding through Space Telescope too, and I was able to collaborate with outside partners as well, IOTA School, Quansight Labs, and then some other Jupyter community members. And our goal was to research and figure out where notebook reading and navigation workflows failed when people were using assistive tech. And then figure out what the preferred experience would be if it wasn't failing, and then try to figure out what are the technical constraints that are influencing this and causing this problem. We're on GitHub. It's all open source. This is entirely open. We've produced a lot of resources for the community, including this hackathon. So please check it out. Please feel free to contribute if you have any thoughts. The method we were using was an iterative problem-solving method. So it's a cyclical workflow where you start with usability testing. So you start with the user who is having the issue. And so that meant we met with people who used assistive tech, and we listened to their feedback. We went through different notebooks and found out where things were breaking. And so specifically, we were talking to a lot of blind and visually impaired people because it's screen readers, magnification, braille readers, things like that we were curious to test with. So we met with those people, and I actually also want to mention a few things about that. We built in funding to pay them, because I think it's really important to pay people for their labor. Also, we had one of the main core contributors on the project was blind himself. He's a blind technologist who runs IOTA schools. So it's really important to have people in the room making these design decisions who are going to use the products. Okay, so after we did this usability testing for a first round, we figured out what the results of that were. We wrote them up and created tasks based on them. And then we had a developer going into a notebook and coming up with a prototype of what a notebook could behave like if it wasn't breaking in those ways. And then we did another round of usability testing, and we also referenced that new updated notebook and then went on from there. So you iterate and iterate. You could see I made this for a poster at JupyterCon, but it's kind of a visualization of what our workflow method is. And you could see that it's circular until you build a solution that you could finally upstream, which we never did. So it would be ideal if we could upstream it, and that means these fixes would just be for anyone using a notebook, but that is not currently the case. So this brings us to what can we do right now? Because right now it's not accessible. The whole situation honestly just sort of sucks. It's a problem, but what can we do without fixing the actual infrastructure, which is a thing we should do, but it's more challenging. Okay, so that brings me to authoring tips. What can you do as an author when creating a Jupyter notebook to make sure your content is more accessible? So that brings us to different ways of accessing information that's been published in notebooks. So there's kind of 3 ways of doing that. The first one is sharing the notebook itself, the IPy file. This format is not accessible, and for a lot of people will have trouble accessing it, right? I mean, if you're able to access it, it's probably the best way of sharing the file. But if someone's using a screen reader, the content inside that file is not going to be accessible. The next way of sharing is to export that notebook as an HTML page. And there's several ways of doing this. There's libraries that do it. And so basically you end up with a web page, a static web page that you can't interact with like a traditional notebook, but has the content. And so what we found is that these are generally accessible in the sense that people can read the information usually, but it is very dependent on what library generated the HTML file, and also how it was formatted. And so this is where authoring comes in. Depending on how you format your notebook will influence how accessible it is once it's exported to HTML. And then we have the content inside the notebooks. And so of course, you can always share that content in another method, maybe as plain text, that it can be entirely accessible. So I think as a general rule to follow, it's a good idea if you're publishing notebooks as a method of sharing information with the community, you should also be publishing it either as a static HTML page or taking the content out and also sharing it in another way. Okay, so now that we went through this high level, let's dive in to these authoring tips. So when you're authoring a notebook, that you plan to share publicly. I mean, it's fine if you're just doing it for yourself, you're doing your own workflow, no one's ever going to see it. But if you're actually creating a resource for the community, it's really important that you format your content so people can actually read it. So we came up with this list based on all of the feedback and usability testing we did with blind and visually impaired. I wrote developers, but actually scientists, students, we had a pretty wide array of people giving feedback. Okay, so the first thing to consider is organization. And this is where accessibility is, like, I think a little bit of a broader thing. This is the type of thing that with wayfinding that will help anyone. It's not really specific to blind or visually impaired people, but it's just good practice. So make sure you're giving context at the beginning, have a title, and a note with this. Notebooks often use Markdown when you're talking about text. Using how you format your Markdown, it has a really big influence on how a screen reader will navigate the page. So doing things like only having one H1 is very important, or else the screen reader is going to start behaving a bit differently than expected. It's not going to walk down the page the way you want. So make sure you have a title and that's the H1. And then after that, you don't use any more H1s. You only use H2s, H3s. Okay. And so if you don't know H1, it's like heading 1 versus a lower heading. Then it's good to have a summary of what is contained in the notebook. A lot of people requested a table of contents as an ordered list as a way of navigating and figuring out what they're going to be looking at, having authors and affiliations, date and time first published, date it was last edited, and then a link to the notebook source. So if people do want to work with the original file, that's really helpful. And I mentioned Markdown. So make sure, other than the H1s, there's other ways that you could break Markdown. Make sure you're using Markdown as intended, and so that way it'll produce proper HTML that a screen reader can read. Use content headings, only one H1, don't skip heading levels. So don't go from H1 to H3. It might like change the size the way you want it visually, but the screen reader will get confused. So you need to use other methods of changing visual cues than skipping headings. Yes, I think that covers that. And here's a visual example. So we have going from heading 1 to heading 3 to heading 6. That's going to read very awkwardly in a screen reader. Okay, so next, images. This is always a bit of a struggle of how to make images accessible. There's a lot here and different, for different people's needs. So the first thing is it's always important to give an image description, describe what an image is and how it's relevant to the rest of the notebook. This is not just for screen reader use. This is for anyone. A lot of times I'll see notebooks that were shared publicly with a plot and it's totally unexplained, unlabeled, not clear to anyone what the intent was. So that's not accessible for anyone. But it is important in these image descriptions to also add it into the alt text if supported. I'm going to jump ahead. So the definition of alt text, it's an HTML element that allows a screen reader to describe what an image is. So a sighted user who's not using a screen reader and not inspecting their web page will not see the alt text, but when a screen reader jumps over the image, it will read out. So it's describing what an image is to someone using a screen reader. Okay. So if alt text is supported, you should add it, but not all images in notebooks support it. Images and figure tags do, but some of the visualization libraries do and some don't. It kind of depends on what visualization library you're using. So if you can't figure out how to add it, when in doubt, just make sure to describe the image in the surrounding text. You could use a caption tag, you could use a separate paragraph. Basically, just make sure it's described somewhere. And then also remember if there's text inside of an image, included in the description. So for instance, if you have a plot, make sure to list somewhere what the plot axes are labeled as. Okay. So with alt text, some things to consider with visualizations. They're a little more specialized. So I mean, just to show you an example of a visualization, they're a little more complicated than, like, let's say I was on a website and there was a picture of a dog. I could just say, it's a dog. But this, you're trying to show a science concept. So what is the pertinent information in a visualization to include? So you have to remember that any of the text inside the image is not going to be read by a screen reader. Also, it might be too small to read with low vision, and a lot of it's low contrast, we found. So even people using magnification were having trouble reading axes. So when writing alt text for a plot, include the information about the type of visualization. So is it a bar chart? Is it a scatter plot? What are you showing? Then make sure to include information for the title, axis labels, the range, and like if there's a legend or key, make sure to also rewrite that as alt text. And give a general explanation of what the visualization's significance is. And this is interesting because if in general you would want to share that with a wider audience, you probably want to share that information anyway with everyone. Okay. So labels. Make sure to label your visualization. People forget to do that way too often. That's very confusing. Include a title, and it should appear visually and also as a plot property. Label the axes and their tick marks. Like, don't forget to do that, or else people have no idea what they're looking at. And include a legend, like show us what the colors mean, what the, like whatever the information means, we need to know what it means. Okay, colors. Colors need to have good contrast, which is the relative difference between them. So if you use a dark gray and black, not going to be contrast against each other, or like a yellow text on a white background. Also, you have to be careful with opacity. A lot of visualization libraries automatically add opacity when they're generating graphs. Oftentimes the lines will be really thin, or they'll choose similar color combinations. So just be careful with that. A way of starting, and it's not always possible, but you can start by plotting in only black and white, and that will have high contrast, and then you can add in color like as needed. But in general, it's not really great to rely on color to convey information. It's kind of a nice addition, but if you can also convey that information through other means like labels or patterns or values, that's also helpful. Okay. So like this is a graph that we pulled out of a notebook. A lot of those colors, and I think it had to do with them automatically having opacity added to them on these lines. A lot of these lines were not, they don't meet contrast standards. I guess it's also worth mentioning that a lot of this is pretty standardized at this point. It's like, it's not a mystery what the contrast needs to be. So you can, there's like a lot of contrast checkers and color libraries you can grab online. And there's a really great tool called Wave that I have installed as a plugin on my browser. And so if I'm doing something on a website, if I'm designing a website, I can click the plugin and it'll pop open and point out all the issues. And it'll point out things like color contrast or mislabeled things, missing alt text. And that's a good place to start as well. Okay. So we're talking about visualizations and how to make sure your data is conveyed properly. This was a big deal. And I think this is a bigger deal for people who will not be getting the full context of your notebook. It could be really nice to link to the direct data itself. So that means if someone is unable to access the notebook fully and interact with it, they can still interact with the data. So they could read maybe the takeaways that you've presented and then look at the data themselves. You know, some people might be able to look at it directly in the notebook, but for those who can't, it's nice to have that option to open it in some other form. Another cool option that's a bit, bit uncommon at the moment, but I hope becomes more common over time, is using sonification as an alternate to just visual plots. Me at MAST, me and a few other people designed a tool called Astronify, and that can be used. It's a Python library that you can use to create time series sonifications. So oh yeah, now it works for spectra too. So if you have a spectra that you just have a plot of, you could add a little sonification that someone can listen to and get a sense of the shape. Okay, text. Links. Links can be really useful for navigating around a document. Make sure to use descriptive link names. This is also true for emails and any other kind of writing you're doing that you're sharing with people. Don't create a link that says click here. It doesn't mean anything. So if someone's jumping through the page with a screen reader, it's like, click here, where am I going? It's much better to put the link on the word that describes where you'll end up. So for instance, if I want to say, come see the resources in Notebooks for All, click here. Instead, I could say, resources available at Notebooks for All GitHub repository. And so that way, when someone is jumping through the links with their screen reader, they'll know exactly where they're going. They'll have the detailed explanation. Okay. Accessibility of language. And so there's lots of reasons that this is more useful, especially when we're doing these really complex topics. But make sure that you're using understandable language, plain language. Define acronyms the first time you use them, and use them pretty sparingly. In astronomy in particular, we overuse acronyms for sure. And only use these very specific fields terms when you need to. In general, it's nice to use approachable language, especially when you're explaining how to understand a document or referencing related literature. It's more inviting, it's more understandable, especially for people newer to the field, perhaps students. And oh, you can access some more general tips on stylistic choices. We have a link here, so you'll have access to this later. Okay, how to show code. So in a Jupyter notebook, right, we have these markdown cells which have plain text, well, I should say formatted text, and then we have code cells. So it's really nice when you could lead into a code cell and explain what's going to happen. So you might add a header. So before your code cell, you might have a markdown cell that with the title imports. And so that way, before you jump into your code cell, the person will have a context of what they're reading. Also, it's really nice to have comments in the code cell, or perhaps in a previous markdown cell, explain what's about to happen in the code cell. And definitely make sure to break up long stretches of code with comments and other descriptions so people can follow what's happening. And with code, if you can control the theme that's it's showing up in, make sure you're using syntax highlighting that actually has accessible contrast. Not all of them do. So, and we found that like having one, like the most clear, straightforward way of achieving a task, show that first, and then later you can mention alternatives. But instead of listing like, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, don't overwhelm your reader, have your one way, and then, you know, clearly differentiate later. You could also try this alternate way. So you could see this example where there's a markdown cell ahead of a code cell, and that in that markdown cell, it spells out what's going to be happening in the code. Okay. Other content types. So notebooks, really, you could have any sort of thing in here. It's, you know, they're pretty flexible. They could have videos, they could have sonifications, they could have interactive widgets. There's all sorts of things. We certainly did not test usability test every single type of widget that could appear in a notebook. But so some general things to consider. Make sure you're using titles, and especially if there's a long or complex content, give them a summary before it starts, like we were saying with the code. Make sure you're not like causing seizures. Don't have flashing objects more than 3 times per second. Also, don't have anything auto playing in the notebook. And these are all things that are also just true of websites in general. Make sure all your visual controls have color contrast. Just in general, the whole notebook needs to have enough color contrast. Make sure you're labeling things. Always list or link to sources of the content so people can go back and access it on their own. Make sure to add captions and subtitles and transcripts to videos. And if you're including information in a widget that may or may not be accessible, and that information is important to understanding your entire message, you need to make sure that that message is accessible in some other way. Like, don't just put it in your weird interactive widget that a screen reader doesn't know what to do with. Have a summary outside so everyone can read it. So, yep, when in doubt, write it out. So you don't want to overwhelm someone by repeating it again and again and again, but at the same time, you don't want to hide information. And the clearest way of making sure everyone knows something is to write it out clearly. Okay, so let's review the important takeaways. In summary, make sure to include context of what you're showing and all the descriptions. Any interactive areas need controls, labels, adequate contrast. Provide links to the sources of data and more information whenever that is applicable. Use Markdown and use it correctly. Don't make up your own thing for your own purposes, like follow standards. And make sure what you create is perceivable, operable, and understandable, as those are the key things in design. Okay, anyone have any questions? Let's see, I see there's some things in the chat, but I haven't been following. Cool.
That was just me putting your slides for reference. Thank you so much. This was great. And yeah, I think we do have some time for questions. And I'd love to hear people from the audience asking questions. Melissa?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to where you were talking about the alt text. And in particular, when you have an image, like it's not a figure that you've created, like with Matplotlib, but it's an image maybe that you're embedding into Markdown. There's a couple different like code ways in the Markdown to embed your image. And if you actually, can we go maybe back? You were mentioning like image and figure tags and something called a caption tag. And I wasn't sure what those were in the notebook context and if you had an example.
Okay. Well, so I think so the image and figure tags, so at least with image tags, that's kind of this, and I'm going to say what I understand. I'll give a further caveat that I actually don't really use notebooks myself very often. I do like user experience design, and I work with people who use notebooks, but I like don't really author them myself. But with image tags, that's kind of the standard HTML, and I think anytime you're putting in a file that is like in the HTML in the image bracket, you're able to add like an alt text attribute. But I'm actually not sure about a caption tag. I think basically that goal, well, I think the caption tag is ways to format the text so it appears under an image in like a caption styling. So basically you could try like the standard alt attribute when you're writing HTML that like you can label, in the expected way, or you can try using the other other options that will appear as text in the file. And so obviously a separate paragraph is pretty clear. That's just standard Markdown. And I'm guessing that there's some sort of caption tag that you can use. I don't really know how to format it or what it is. Like obviously image is, like the bracket, img colon, like, you put in the file thing and then you add alt equals, and then you like quote the alt text. I hope that answers your question. We could explore it more later and see what's available.
Yeah, I think we've seen how to like add alt text when you're embedding an image. And then I think here it was the caption tags. I was wondering if you're using a screen reader, I know you can use like the headings and then you can navigate to a particular part in the HTML file using the headings. And I was wondering if caption tags are like offer another way for a user with a screen reader to like just flip through captions and like, oh, I want to go back to figure 3 kind of thing.
I am not sure about that.
Yeah,
I
okay.
don't think we tested that.
Yeah, we can find out. Cool. Okay, thanks.
And I was wondering if you had any experience with accessibility issues with formulas in the notebooks themselves. I don't know if they're expressed typically in LaTeX or and is it read by the screen reader properly or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The answer is I don't think it automatically is read correctly if you use a standard formula, like markup, or I don't know what the term would be, but I actually want to like take a moment after we're done here and like look back at my notes and get back to you about the best way of handling that, because we did receive feedback about that. I think including if you can include like the LaTeX code itself that writes out the formula, I think that's useful. But then I remember hearing that, but then hearing that that's still like what it spits out is still not readable by a screen reader. So I need to like look that up and get back to you, but I know we took notes on it. Becky?
Hi. So Melissa's question made me wonder if we have, maybe this is a more general, like Ruben question. I feel like we have good guidelines for how to make we have a good like guideline document for how to make the notebooks accessible. Does that include any sort of guidance for like an example, how to write like an alt caption for images or plots? I was thinking that might be like a good thing to have in there, and then people could kind of use that as a jumping off point for many of the plots in these notebooks.
Well, it's interesting you mention. So we have, I'm not sure if what that checklist is, we created a checklist. It might be what you're talking about. It looks something like this. I don't know if we have an example in there. It's come up a few times that people think it would be really useful to have an example notebook that shows this accessible like content, like has examples of the different versions. We don't currently have that, but I agree that that would be a good resource.
Yeah,
for
Melissa
community.
just shared the RTN link to the, oh, okay. We already have this.
Yeah, we've gone through a lot of the notebooks for all and a lot of guidance on accessibility notebooks. And so far we've got it into the Rubin document that provides guidelines for notebooks. But I mean, I think it's not complete yet, and we're still considering like some of the details. So yeah, we do have some guidance there in our internal document, which is like, it came straight from.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
provided from, yeah.
Apologies, I'm definitely relatively new to this, but
I know.
it's a good talk. This has me thinking.
Bob?
So I was wondering, is there a role for AI in reviewing your code for accessibility and giving you hints?
Yeah, it's really funny you say that. I'm on like a industry panel thing for this accessibility grant, and that was one of their big questions, like how does AI influence accessibility? And I'm involved in an AI group at Space Telescope, and I posted that to the Slack chat, and no one answered me. I mean, I've started thinking about it a little bit this week, and I mean, sure, there's people who are much more involved in this than me and probably have spent a lot more time thinking about it. So that's a caveat. But I think it's interesting, the idea of creating alt text like with AI. That seems like an obvious thing that would probably work pretty well. I'm sure there's a lot more like things that AI can do about describing situations, or I mean, people do already have apps where they have their camera on their phone and they move it around and they get descriptions, and it's not necessarily like, sometimes it could be a person on the other side, but I think there's some AI. I mean, certainly AI can read signs for people. So there, I mean, there definitely is. I don't know the extent of it.
Yeah, I found I can ask an AI what to describe a figure in a paper, and it can do it. And I was wondering, not only could I improve the accessibility of my code, but it might be able to read it to somebody.
Mhm.
So, okay. Thank you.
Definitely potential. Any other questions?
I did have one more question about sonification, and I'm sure that I think I could Google the answer to this one, but maybe if you do like make a sonification for a plot and it's like saved as a file, is there a way to embed it in the notebook, and can you play it straight from a notebook?
Yes, I'm like 99% sure that yes, you can. Well, and it's so when actually the reason I even found out that accessibility in notebooks was an issue is because the first accessibility project I worked on at Space Telescope was creating this sonification software. And initially, even in our proposal, we wrote, oh, and we're going to make sure all of the resources we create are super accessible by producing them in Jupyter notebooks. And we were planning on, we had our whole library in it, and we're had examples of it generating a sonification, and then you could play it right from the notebook. Yeah, so okay, 100%, I'm sure that you can. So we created these, and then we went, we worked with the community to do testing, and then we pretty much immediately found out that notebooks were not an acceptable way of sharing these sonifications. And so, and then after that, I was just kind of hearing, as we were working with the community, of like, and hearing stories and how like notebooks really are this, they're so important with data science right now. It's just a pivotal tool that people use. They use it right at the beginning of their education in data science and coding a lot of the time. And they don't work with screen readers. So that's how I actually found out about it. But yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, do you know if there's an example? Because like I know how to embed an image in HTML in a markdown cell, and that will show up fine. But I'm not sure how to embed like an audio file. It's probably a
Sure.
way.
I don't know how, but I know we must have some Astronify notebooks, so the sonification examples.
Yeah.
I could ask the developer and see, and I could send you one.
Yeah, and that link, the link to Astronify in your slides probably goes to a GitHub repo.
Yeah, I think it goes to our, it's kind of the landing page for our repo. It's like styled a little differently, but you can access all the documentation from there. But I don't know that we link to notebooks anymore. Like that was the initial plan, but we ended up creating it and read the docs just so all the content would be, make sure it was readable by a screen reader.
Interesting. I'll take a look through.
But even if it's not published on, well, I would think there might be one in our repo because I know the developers have used them.
Yeah, I'll look into it, how to embed a audio clip in a markdown cell. Okay.
Riley?
Hi, yeah, I thought I'd just follow up on Melissa's question by mentioning that the IPython display package has an audio an audio component that you can, if you have a local audio file, you can use IPython display to put a play button in the output of the cell. I don't know about embedding in, I don't exactly know about embedding audio in the markdown cell, but I just thought I'd mention the IPython display option.
Yeah, does that work then also once you output your whole notebook as an HTML, it stays clickable?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't
Yeah.
know. I haven't tested that.
Okay, yeah, maybe we can test that.
Any final questions or thoughts before we move into the hack activity?
I do have one more question, and it's about comments in code blocks. Because it's
Okay.
part of our own guidelines to avoid mixing comments and code together to keep code cells fully executable and to try to just do shorter code cells with more explanation in the markdown. And part of the reason for that was because I wasn't sure how a screen reader, because when you have a comment in a code cell, it's preceded with the hashtag. Can a screen reader know like what is comment and what is code in a code cell?
So, oh yeah, I'm unmuted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So what, the guidelines we wrote, for sure, they're like, it was actually only a first version. It's just the only thing like this that exists. So if you have belief that that is a better way, I bet it is. And we should definitely build on these, and we can like envelop that back into these, this checklist. But the answer to the question is no. I mean, basically it has to do with how carefully you're listening. In current notebook formats, there's actually no differentiation between a markdown plot or a code plot. So when you're looking at it, there's a visual distinction. There's the squares around them, and then some white space and another square. And then also there's there's like some brackets on the upper left that calls out what cell it is. The screen reader does read that, but it reads it so fast because most people who use them are listening at really fast speed. It's if they like slow down and know what to look for, they can like kind of do Control F, like they could search for the cell and find it. But if they're just kind of reading through, it's not that apparent where one cell starts and the other one starts. like where one ends and that space between them. And really the only thing differentiating a markdown cell from a code cell is the content inside of it. So people are contextually able to figure out, oh, I'm in a code cell now because it's reading code. But yeah, I think the way that the code cell would read out with comments is they would have a bunch of code just reading out, and then it would say, it would read out like / or whatever, however you make a comment in Python, and then it would read the comment, and then, but the thing is, people, once it's code, I guess it depends what kind of reading they're doing. If they're really trying to understand it, they might be slowly going through and thinking through what each line of code means, but they might just like be going right through it. So a comment might be missed. I think it's a really good point that having comments in the code, it's very likely to be just kind of glossed over. A comment about this is one of the key things we tried to implement in our prototype notebook, that you can navigate not just by headers, which is a standard way that screen reader users navigate through web pages. They there's like a button where they'll just go header, 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 and that's kind of a way of getting a sense of the whole page, an overview, like a glance, and then they'll dive into each header. Doing something similar, but having it with code blocks, or not code blocks, like cells, different cells. So you go like, I'm in cell 1, now I'm in cell 2, and you kind of flip between cells. That was something we played with. But yeah, of course, it's not in the, the current standard notebook feature, but that is, I think, a good usability dream of how it might behave in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all interesting. The other reason we kind of like to not have commented outlines in a code cell is because a lot of our users they can be even like very new to Python. And so that anything that's commented out in a code cell, having commented out code in a code cell makes sense, so that everything in that cell is still executable. It's just that the only thing that's commented out is optional code. And it can be more a little worried, like people really new to Python might not quite understand sometimes like the difference. So yeah, different type of accessibility in related to code cell comments. Yeah.
I really like this comment, and I encourage anyone, if you have thoughts like this, this whole checklist and everything is on GitHub. I would love to get pull requests and suggestions for things to add, things to edit. We definitely would encompass it in. Yes, Rob.
I don't know if this is useful or not, but what I'll do is, when I'm just about finished with the code, I'll collapse all of the code and see if it makes sense. So I just have the markdown and the plots, and it should make sense without the code. I don't know if that's useful or not.
Yeah, that seems like a good workflow to figuring it out. Okay, shall we move on to describing this hack activity? I think we're good to do that. So let's continue. Okay, so hacking. So we have